The candle had burned down to a stub of grease and thread, and still Eleanor Winslow did not move to relight it. She sat curled into the window seat of the Ravenscombe library, knees drawn to her chest, the cold glass fogging faintly with her breath, and she wept the way she had taught herself to weep years ago, silently, economically, without a single sound that might carry beyond the door. She had learned that lesson the hard way, the year she was 12, when her aunt had found her crying over her mother's letters and told her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that tears were a currency the poor could not afford to spend where others might see the price. She did not know, as she pressed her sleeve to her eyes in the near dark, that she was not alone. Behind the tall shelf of estate ledgers at the far end of the room, a man stood utterly still, a lit taper forgotten in his hand, listening to a young woman's heart come undone in a language far more honest than any that had been spoken to him in the whole of the London season. He had come into the library to fetch a survey map. He had meant to be gone in a minute. Instead, he stood rooted between two shelves of leather-bound accounts, unwilling to announce himself, unwilling to leave, caught between the manners of a gentleman and the curiosity of a man who had spent 3 weeks pretending to be someone he was not, and who had just heard, in 6 broken sentences, more truth than the whole of Ravenscombe Hall had offered him since his arrival. He did not yet know her name. She did not yet know his. And neither of them knew, in that hushed and candle-starved room, that the next 30 seconds would decide the shape of both their lives. To understand how a duke came to be crouched behind a bookshelf listening to a weeping girl he had not yet been introduced to, one must go back 3 weeks, to the grey October morning when a plain hired gig rattled up the drive of Ravenscombe Hall, driven by a man in a serviceable brown coat who gave his name, with perfect composure, as Mr. Julian Hart. Julian Ashworth, 9th Duke of Rothmere, had not lied outright. He had simply declined to finish the sentence. Hart was, after all, his mother's family name, tucked 2 generations back in a line so heavy with titles that no one at Ravenscombe thought to question a land surveyor who introduced himself with anything less than a lord or a sir attached. He had arrived with a letter of introduction, forged in the strictest sense, though the hand that wrote it was his own solicitor's at the Duke's private instruction, describing him as an agent sent ahead of a certain nobleman's household, tasked with assessing the boundaries, the timber, and the general condition of the estate before any formal arrangement was made. It was, in its way, entirely true. He simply omitted that he was the nobleman. He had done this before deciding on lesser matters, a horse, a hunting lodge, once even a wine merchant whose glowing reputation he had wanted tested without the flattery that his title inevitably summoned. But he had never done it before deciding on a wife, and he told himself, climbing down from the gig with his own modest trunk in hand, that this was precisely why it mattered more than it ever had. For 6 months, his aunt, the Dowager Duchess, had pressed him toward Miss Camilla Pembroke, celebrated the length of 2 counties for her beauty, her accomplishments, her father's respectable if precarious estate. Lord Pembroke, for his part, had made no secret that he required the match urgently. A duke's alliance could quiet certain debts that whispered louder each season. Julian had met Camilla twice, at balls where she had been coached, powdered, and presented like a prize mare, and both times he had come away with the uneasy sense that he had met a performance and not a person. He was 31 years old. He had buried a father who died believing love was a luxury dukes could not afford, and a mother who had died, Julian privately suspected, of the slow starvation of never once being loved for herself, rather than her jointure. He did not intend to repeat either of their marriages, and so, against the protests of his solicitor and the outright horror of his aunt, he had written to Lord Pembroke proposing that his agent survey the estate ahead of any formal courtship, and had then quietly arranged to become that agent himself. He wanted to see the family when it did not know a duke was watching. What he had not accounted for was Eleanor. She was, by every measure Ravenscombe cared to apply, a person of no consequence at all. Orphaned at 9 when a fever took both her parents within a fortnight of each other, she had been brought into her aunt and uncle's household not from affection, but from obligation. A poor relation, absorbed the way one absorbs a debt, grudgingly, and with careful accounting of what she cost against what she was worth. She was 23 now, unmarried, unpretty by the careless standard her aunt applied in comparing her to Camilla's golden curls, and entirely without dowry, which in the arithmetic of Ravenscombe made every other quality irrelevant. She taught Camilla's younger sisters their letters. She kept the household accounts that Lady Pembroke found tedious. She mended what needed mending, and said thank you for meals she had half prepared herself, and she had grown so accustomed to being looked past that she had developed, without meaning to, a way of moving through rooms as though she took up less space than she did. It was this quality, not beauty, not wit, though she possessed a quiet reserve of both, that first made Julian notice her, on his second morning at Ravenscombe, when he came upon her in the stable-yard, attempting, with visible determination and no success at all, to calm a spooked carriage-horse that the grooms had abandoned as too much trouble before their breakfast. "You'll want to stop pulling at the bridle," he said, before he had decided to speak at all. "He isn't afraid of you. He's afraid of the noise behind him." She turned, startled. A wisp of hair escaped from its pins and stuck damply to her temple, and looked at him with an expression that held no calculation whatsoever, only the frank assessment of someone deciding whether a stranger's advice was worth taking. "And what noise is that?" she asked. "The cartwheel. It's dragging a loose iron rim against the cobbles every time it turns. Have someone see to it, and he'll settle." She looked past him, listened, and her face changed, not into simpering gratitude, which he had braced for out of long habit, but into simple, unadorned relief. "Thank you," she said, and then, because the horse was still trembling, she did not spare him further attention at all, but turned back and murmured something low and steady to the animal until it stood quiet under her hand. Julian had stood in that stable-yard a full minute longer than necessary, watching a woman in a plain grey dress accomplish with patience what 2 grooms had abandoned in irritation, and had felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a ready name for. He learned her name at supper that evening, when Lady Pembroke, seating her guests with the precision of a general arranging troops, waved a hand toward the far end of the table and said, without particular interest, "And that is my niece, Miss Winslow. She keeps the children in order." It was not cruelty exactly. Lady Pembroke did not think herself unkind, but it was the tone one used for a piece of useful furniture, and Julian, watching Eleanor's face carefully arrange itself into pleasant neutrality, understood in that instant precisely what kind of house he had entered. He was seated, by design, near Camilla, who spoke to him for the better part of an hour about the merits of a duke she had apparently decided, sight unseen, that she would very much enjoy marrying, praising his reputed wealth, his reputed London house, his reputed hunting box in Leicestershire, all facts she had gathered second-hand and offered up now as though reciting a catechism she had memorized for exactly this purpose. Julian answered politely and watched, from the corner of his eye, the woman at the far end of the table who said almost nothing at all and who twice quietly reached across to cut a child's meat into smaller pieces without once being thanked for it. It was, he told himself later, only curiosity that made him seek her out again the following day. He was a careful man, methodical in the way he had learned to be after watching his father's estates nearly ruined by carelessness dressed up as charm, and he told himself that observing every member of the household, including the poor niece, was simply part of the survey he had come to conduct. He did not entirely believe himself, even then. Their second conversation happened in the orangery, where Eleanor had gone to escape a tedious afternoon of listening to Camilla practice the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than skill, and where Julian had gone, ostensibly, to inspect the glasswork for his notional employer's benefit. He found her standing among the lemon trees with a book held loosely in one hand, not reading it, simply standing in the warm green light with her eyes closed, and for a moment he nearly turned and left, rather than disturb something that looked, to him, remarkably like the first true peace he had witnessed in that house. "You're meant to be inspecting glasswork," she said, without opening her eyes, "not staring at me, Mr. Hart." "I wasn't staring," he said, which was not strictly true. "I was determining whether the frost damage on the east panes is recent. It is 3 years old. My uncle has been promising to have it seen to since before I arrived at an age to notice such things." She opened her eyes then, and there was a dry humor in them that surprised him. Not bitterness, though she had cause enough for it, but something wry and self-possessed. A woman who had made her peace with disappointment by refusing to let it curdle into self-pity. "You may tell your employer, whoever he is, that Ravenscombe's beauty is somewhat better maintained than its bones. You dislike it here," he said, and immediately regretted the bluntness of it. A duke might say such a thing to a companion and expect only agreement, but Mr. Hart, land surveyor, had no such license, and he watched her weigh whether to answer him honestly at all. "I am fortunate to have a roof and food and family," she said carefully, in the voice of someone reciting a lesson she had been made to learn. "That isn't what I asked." Something in her expression flickered, surprise perhaps, that a stranger had noticed the gap between what she said and what she meant. "No," she admitted, so quietly he nearly missed it. "It isn't what you asked." She did not elaborate further that day, and he did not press her, sensing correctly that trust, with this particular woman, was not a door that could be forced, but only one that might, with patience, be left unlocked long enough for her to open it herself. He found himself returning to that orangery, and to the stable yard, and to the modest walking path along the eastern hedge, with a frequency that had nothing to do with surveying, and everything to do with the peculiar hunger he felt to hear Eleanor Winslow speak plainly about anything at all: the weather, the children's lessons, a novel she had borrowed and not yet returned, the particular ache of watching swallows leave in autumn and knowing you could not follow them. She spoke to him, he came to understand, precisely because she believed he was no one of consequence, a land agent, a man of modest means and no title, someone whose opinion of her could cost her nothing because he had no power over her life. It was, he realized with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, the very freedom his disguise had been designed to create. He had wanted to see people as they truly were. He had not accounted for how much it would cost him to be seen, in turn, as someone he was not. Camilla, meanwhile, treated him with the particular attentiveness of a woman auditioning for a role she believed already hers. She was not unkind to Eleanor, precisely. She simply did not see her, in the way one does not see the furniture one has grown up walking past. And twice Julian watched her issue small, careless instructions that stripped an evening's rest from her cousin without a flicker of awareness that she had done so. "Eleanor, do see that the children are settled before you retire. I find I am too fatigued. Eleanor, my blue silk wants mending before the assembly. You have such a talent for it." Small requests, offered with the ease of someone who had never once considered that they might be refused, and never once thanked with anything beyond the assumption that gratitude was unnecessary between family. It was Lord Pembroke's debts that gave the household its true undercurrent of danger, and Julian learned of them, not through any confidence, but through the careless talk of servants, who did not think a land agent worth guarding their tongues around. Pembroke owed a substantial sum to a Mr. Silas Crane, a mill owner of considerable new wealth and considerably less refinement, who had extended credit against the estate on terms that had grown, over 2 bad harvests, increasingly difficult to meet. Crane, it was whispered below stairs, had begun to hint that he would consider a portion of the debt forgiven in exchange for a match with one of the family's daughters, and since Camilla was promised, in Pembroke's mind at least, to a duke, The family's attention had begun, with quiet and increasing dread, to settle on Eleanor instead. She had no dowry to offer Crane. She had, Pembroke reasoned in the ledger-book logic that governed every decision in that house, herself, her labour, her obedience, her willingness to be disposed of for the good of a family that had never once disposed of anything in her favour. Eleanor did not learn of the arrangement from her uncle directly. She learned it the way she learned most things of consequence in that house, second-hand, through a door left carelessly ajar on an ordinary Tuesday evening when she had gone to fetch her aunt's shawl and instead heard her name spoken in a tone that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "Crane has all but said it outright," Lord Pembroke was saying, his voice thick with the particular relief of a man who believes he has solved a problem without having to feel its weight. "Forgive half the note," he says, "if there's a wife in it for him. He doesn't care that she's plain or that she's past the age most men would look twice at her. He wants a woman who'll keep his house and not embarrass him with heirs. Eleanor will do very well." "She has no dowry to bring him," Lady Pembroke said, though there was no real objection in it, only the tone of someone confirming a transaction's terms. "She brings him half my debt forgiven, which is worth a great deal more than any dowry she'd have had regardless. It is generous of him, all things considered. She ought to be grateful." Eleanor stood in the corridor with her aunt's shawl clutched to her chest and felt something in her chest crack quietly down the middle, the way ice cracks on a pond, not loudly, not all at once, but with a sound only she could hear, that told her nothing beneath it would ever be quite solid again. She did not cry that night. She had learned, long ago, to ration her tears for moments when no one at all could witness them, and that corridor, with its thin walls and its careless voices, was not private enough to spend even one. It was 3 days later, 3 days in which she had smiled at breakfast, mended Camilla's silk without complaint, and said nothing at all to anyone of what she had overheard, that she finally found herself alone in the library on a rain-soaked evening, the household occupied elsewhere with a dinner she had been excused from on the grounds that a poor relation added little to a table meant to impress a visiting duke's agent, and it was there, in the near dark, curled into the window seat, with the rain streaking grey down the glass, that she finally allowed herself to weep. She did not know that Julian had come to the library for the survey map he had genuinely misplaced, and had heard the door open behind him before he could announce his presence, and had gone still out of the same instinct that made a man freeze rather than startle a bird he did not wish to lose. She spoke, at first, only to herself, the low, disjointed murmur of a person testing words she has not dared say aloud until now. "I am not a person to them," she whispered. "I am an entry in a ledger, half a debt. That is the whole of my worth. In this house, half a debt, forgiven." A broken breath. "I used to think, when I was small, that if I was good enough, useful enough, patient enough, someone would love me for it. I have been so patient." Her voice cracked on the word, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, as though she might catch the sound before it escaped, and gave herself away. Behind the ledger shelves, Julian did not breathe. "I do not even mind so very much being poor," she went on, quieter now, as though the confession had exhausted the loudest part of her grief and left only the honest remainder. "I have never minded that. What I mind is being sold as though I were a horse with no other use left in it. What I mind is that no one has asked me, not once, whether I could bear it. They have only decided that I must." A long silence, filled with the rain. "I think I would rather be poor and unloved my whole life than married to a man who bought me the way one buys a length of cloth. I think," her voice broke entirely now, and the sob that followed was small and strangled and utterly without artifice, the sound of a woman who believed with absolute certainty that no living soul could hear her. "I think I would rather no one ever love me at all than be loved the way Camilla is loved, as an ornament, a use, a convenience. I would rather be alone forever than be told my worth in shillings and half-forgiven debts." She wept then in earnest, silently, her shoulders shaking with the effort of making no sound at all, and Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rothmere, stood frozen behind a shelf of estate ledgers with a dead candle in his hand, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, something that was not pity and was not admiration, but some fiercer, more dangerous mixture of both, the specific ache of watching someone he had come to care for reveal a wound so raw and so entirely unguarded that he understood, with total clarity, he had no right to have witnessed it. He should have announced himself. Every rule of honor he had been raised on told him so. Instead, he stood motionless, torn between the decency that demanded he make his presence known and the selfish, aching wish to let her finish, to hear, uninterrupted, the whole unguarded truth of a woman who had never once spoken so freely to him, or perhaps to anyone. It was the creak of his own boot heel against the floorboard, shifted without his meaning to, that betrayed him. Eleanor's head snapped up. In the near dark, she could make out only a shape between the shelves, tall, still, unmistakably a man, and her whole body went rigid with a horror so complete it momentarily swallowed even her grief. "Who is there?" Her voice, thick with tears, came out sharper than she intended, armored in the only weapon she had left. Julian stepped forward into what little candlelight remained, and saw her face change from fear to a mortification so total it was almost worse to witness than her weeping had been. She scrambled up from the window seat, dashing at her eyes with the back of her hand, putting the width of a reading table between them as though distance alone might undo what had already happened. "Mr. Hart!" Her voice cracked on his false name, and something in Julian's chest twisted at the sound of it, at how easily she trusted a name that was not real, and how thoroughly that trust had just been repaid with deceit she did not yet know existed. "How long have you? How much did you?" She could not finish either question. She did not need to. Her face had already answered it for her. "Long enough," he said quietly, because he would not compound one dishonesty with another, "to understand you did not know I was here, and long enough that I owe you an apology far greater than the one I am about to give." "You had no right." Her voice shook, but it did not break. She drew herself up instead, wounded pride replacing raw grief with startling speed, and Julian understood in that moment precisely why she had survived 7 years in a house that valued her so little. "Whatever you heard was not meant for any ears at all, least of all a stranger's." "I know it," he said, "and I will not pretend otherwise to spare myself. I should have spoken the moment I heard the door. I did not, and that failure is mine to answer for, not yours." Something in his voice, steadier, graver, entirely without the careless amusement Camilla so often provoked in gentlemen visitors, made Eleanor look at him more closely than she had allowed herself to before, searching his face for mockery, and finding, to her confusion, none at all. "You will say nothing of this," she said, and it was not quite a request. "I will say nothing of this," he agreed, "unless you wish it said." She studied him a moment longer, some fragile and unfamiliar thing passing behind her eyes, not quite trust, not yet, but the first uncertain step toward it, and then, without another word, she gathered what remained of her composure like a cloak drawn tight against the cold, and left him alone in the library with a dead candle and a truth he had no idea, in that moment, how he would ever find the courage to confess. He did not sleep that night. He lay awake in the modest guest chamber assigned to Mr. Hart, smaller and colder than any room he had occupied since boyhood, and he found he did not mind it, found instead that its plainness suited the raw honesty of what he had heard, turning over Eleanor's words until they had worn a groove into his thoughts, as deep as any riverbed. She had not spoken like a woman angling for sympathy. She had spoken like a woman who believed, with the particular despair of long practice, that no one was listening at all, and that was precisely what made her words unbearable to a man who had spent his adult life surrounded by people who calculated every syllable for effect. He thought of Camilla's careful recitation of his reputed fortune. He thought of his aunt's letters, each one a fresh argument for why beauty and connection outweighed whatever vague, unfashionable notion he clung to about affection. He thought of his own mother, dead these 6 years, who had told him once, in a rare, unguarded moment near the end, that she had loved his father desperately for a single season before understanding she had been chosen for her bloodline and not her heart, and that the knowledge had hollowed her out slowly, over 30 years, until there was nothing left to bury but the shape of a duchess. He would not do that to Eleanor, he would not do it to himself. But he could not yet see a way to tell her the truth, without confirming, in the cruelest possible fashion, the very fear she had wept over, that she was, to every person of consequence in her life, only ever a transaction waiting to be finalized. If he revealed himself now as the Duke her uncle had angled to secure for Camilla, what could Eleanor possibly believe, except that she had been deceived, observed, perhaps even toyed with, by a man of exactly the sort of power that had already decided her worth in half-forgiven debts? He told himself he needed time. He told himself, less honestly, that he was not yet ready to lose the particular version of himself that existed only in Eleanor's eyes. Mr. Hart, a man of no consequence, loved, or at least trusted, for nothing but himself. It was a decision he would come, before the month was out, to regret bitterly. In the days that followed, something had changed between them, subtle but unmistakable. The careful distance of two people who had shared something neither quite knew how to name. Eleanor no longer sought him out in the orangery with the easy unguardedness of before. She had grown watchful, a little wary, as though testing whether his kindness in the library had been a fluke of decency or a true measure of the man. Julian, for his part, found himself watching her with an attention that had outgrown mere curiosity days ago and now bordered, he was forced to admit to himself, on his solitary walks along the eastern hedge, on something considerably more dangerous to a man in his position. He began, in small and deliberate ways, to make her life at Ravenscombe less burdensome. He arranged, through a quiet word to the head groom that cost him nothing but a coin, and a plausible excuse about wishing the stables kept orderly for his employer's future visits, for the loose cartwheel to be repaired, so the horses no longer spooked, and so Eleanor was no longer called upon to calm them before breakfast. He found reasons to occupy the younger Pembroke girls with lessons in map reading and simple surveying, genuine skills he possessed and enjoyed teaching, that gave Eleanor, for the first time in longer than she could remember, an hour or two each afternoon that belonged entirely to herself. He never announced these small mercies. He simply performed them and let her discover them on her own, and it was this quality, the absence of any demand for gratitude or acknowledgement, that began, more than any single conversation could have, to soften the guarded place in her chest that had learned, through long practice, to expect nothing freely given. "You did not have to see to the wheel," she said to him one grey morning, finding him in the stable yard with no obvious reason to be there at all. "I know it was you. Thomas let it slip." "I dislike the sound of dragging iron," Julian said mildly. "It is a matter of my own comfort, I assure you. You are a poor liar, Mr. Hart." But there was warmth in it now, not accusation, and something in her face when she said his false name made his chest ache with a guilt he could not yet bring himself to resolve. "I have been told that before," he said, with a wryness that was, though she could not know it, more honest than anything else he had said to her since his arrival. Their friendship, for that was the only word either of them dared use, though both privately suspected it had already outgrown the term, deepened through such small exchanges, built not on grand declarations, but on the steady accumulation of 1,000 small honesties. A book left where she would find it, with a passage marked that he thought she'd enjoy. A walk along the hedge where she finally told him, haltingly, about her parents, about the fever that had taken them both within a fortnight and left her, at 9 years old, understanding for the first time that love could be taken away without warning or fairness. An evening in the music room, empty of everyone but themselves, where he discovered she played the pianoforte with far more feeling than technical polish, and told her so, and watched her flush with a pleasure so unguarded it undid something in him he had thought quite solidly built. "You are the first person," she told him one afternoon, watching the rain streak the orangery glass, "who has ever asked me what I wanted, rather than telling me what I ought to want." "What do you want, Miss Winslow?" he asked, and meant it as more than idle conversation, though he kept his voice light enough that she might answer or deflect as she chose. She was quiet a long moment, turning the question over, as though testing whether it was safe to answer honestly. "I want," she said finally, "to matter to someone, not for what I can do for them, or what debt I can offset, but simply because I am myself. I know it is a small and foolish thing to want." "It is not foolish," Julian said, more roughly than he intended. "It is the only thing worth wanting at all." She looked at him then, with an expression he would carry with him the rest of his life, startled, searching, the first unguarded hope he had seen cross her face since his arrival. And it was in that look, more than in any of the weeks that preceded it, that Julian understood with total and terrifying clarity that he had stopped observing Eleanor Winslow as part of any survey, and had instead, somewhere in the space of 3 short weeks, fallen entirely and irrevocably in love with her. He resolved, that same evening, to tell her the truth before the week was out. He did not get the chance. The letter arrived the following morning, carried by a rider in Rothmere livery who had ridden hard through the night and made no effort to disguise his errand from the household, a grave miscalculation on the part of Julian's solicitor, who had believed the matter urgent enough to justify breaking the careful secrecy of the arrangement. Lord Pembroke, intercepting the rider in the front hall before Julian could reach him, read the direction on the letter, "His Grace the Duke of Rothmere, care of Ravenscombe Hall," and went very still, and then very pale, and then, with the particular speed of a man recalculating an entire fortune's worth of opportunity in the space of a heartbeat, exceedingly warm. "Mr. Hart," he said, when Julian came down the stairs to find the entire household assembled in the hall, Pembroke holding the letter aloft like a trophy. "Or should I say, Your Grace, you might have spared us all a great deal of confusion." There was no undoing it. Julian saw, in the space of that single frozen moment, every careful wall of his disguise collapse at once, saw Lady Pembroke's face transform from polite indifference to a naked, calculating delight, saw Camilla's eyes widen and her mouth curve into a smile of pure triumph, already rearranging in her mind the whole of her future, and saw, worst of all, at the edge of the gathered household, Eleanor Winslow go utterly white, her hand rising slowly to her throat, as though she might physically hold back the understanding breaking over her. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke was saying, already bowing, already transformed by the discovery into a man Julian recognized instantly and with disgust, the very sort of fawning, calculating creature he had disguised himself precisely to avoid. "Forgive the informality of your reception, had we known." "That was rather the point of not knowing," Julian said, but his eyes had not left Eleanor's face, and what he saw there undid him more thoroughly than any accusation could have. She was not looking at him with triumph, or even simple shock. She was looking at him the way one looks at a wound only just discovered, with the particular, quiet devastation of someone realizing that every honest thing she had believed about the last 3 weeks had been built, however unknowingly on his part, on a foundation of deceit. He watched her mind work through it in real time, the library, her tears, her confession of a fear so raw she had believed no one alive could hear it, spoken not to a poor land agent who could do nothing with the knowledge, but to the very Duke whose power over her family's fate was absolute. "You heard me," she said, so quietly that only he, standing nearest, could make out the words over the rising clamor of Pembroke's delighted apologies. "In the library. You heard everything, and you let me believe. She stopped. Her throat worked once, twice, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and careful. The voice of a woman rebuilding her defenses, brick by brick, in real time. You let me believe you were no one. Eleanor. Miss Winslow, she corrected, with a precision that struck him harder than any raised voice could have. To your grace. And before he could find any words equal to the wreckage he had caused, she turned and walked from the hall with a composure that cost her, he could see even from a distance, everything she had left. The days that followed were a study in exactly the transformation Julian had disguised himself to escape. Lord Pembroke, having recovered from his shock, treated him now with an oily, ingratiating warmth that made Julian's skin crawl. Lady Pembroke began speaking of the wedding, for it was assumed, universally and instantly, that the match with Camilla would now proceed with even greater speed and ceremony, as though it were a settled fact, requiring only the correct order of flowers. Camilla herself grew radiant, practicing before Julian an entirely new range of laughter and glances she had evidently been saving for the occasion of his revealed rank, and Julian found himself unable to spend even a quarter hour in her company without comparing, bitterly and involuntarily, the calculated brightness of her attention to the plain, unpolished honesty he had lost the moment his name became known. Eleanor, meanwhile, had retreated behind a courtesy so perfect it was itself a kind of wall. She curtsied to him now, when their paths crossed. She addressed him correctly, deferentially, with none of the wry warmth that had once colored every exchange between them. She had, in the space of a single afternoon, transformed herself back into exactly the invisible, useful, uncomplaining creature the household had always required her to be, and Julian understood, with a grief that startled him in its intensity, that she had done it deliberately, as armor, because the alternative was to let him see how badly he had wounded her, and she had already given him that particular gift once, unknowingly, in the dark of the library, and would not be made to give it twice. He tried, twice, to speak with her privately, and both times she deflected him with a courtesy so flawless it left him no honest opening at all. Your Grace is too kind, but I am wanted in the nursery. Until he understood that continuing to press would only confirm, in her eyes, that his rank had made him exactly the sort of man who believed he could demand a hearing, regardless of what he had already forfeited. It was Mr. Silas Crane's unexpected arrival, 10 days after the revelation, that broke the fragile stalemate open entirely. Crane came to Ravenscombe not as a suitor asking permission, but as a creditor collecting what he considered already promised, a heavy-set man of perhaps 45, dressed with the particular ostentation of new money determined to announce itself, who greeted Lord Pembroke with the easy familiarity of a man who knew precisely how much power his ledger gave him over the household's future. He had come, he announced over dinner, to fix a date. He saw no reason for further delay. Miss Winslow was of an age where further waiting served no one, and he assured the table with a smile that made Eleanor's stomach turn, a patient man, but not an infinitely patient one. Julian sat through that dinner with his hands clenched beneath the tablecloth, watching Eleanor hold her composure through a conversation that treated her, quite literally, as a line item being settled, and understood that whatever damage his deception had done, he could not now allow his wounded pride, or her wounded trust, to stand between her and a fate infinitely worse than either. He found her afterward in the garden, where she had fled the moment the meal permitted it, standing beneath the bare branches of an old chestnut, with her arms wrapped tight around herself against the cold. "You cannot marry that man," he said, without preamble, because there was no longer time for the slow, careful rebuilding of trust he had hoped to attempt. "It is not your concern, Your Grace." But her voice shook on the title, and he heard, beneath the careful formality, the same raw grief he had overheard in the library, no better hidden now than it had been then. "It is entirely my concern," he said. "I have made it my concern from the moment I first heard you weeping over the very fate you are now being handed as though it were a mercy. "And what would you have me do instead?" She turned on him then, and the composure cracked at last, months and years of careful restraint breaking loose in a single furious question. "Wait for you to decide, at your leisure, whether the poor niece was worth the inconvenience of honesty. You let me believe you were nothing, and I told you things I have told no living soul, and you said nothing. You let me go on believing." Her voice broke. "Do you know what it is, to learn that the only person who ever made you feel like more than a debt was studying you the entire time, deciding whether you were worth his notice?" "I was not studying you," Julian said, and the rawness in his own voice startled him as much as it seemed to startle her. "I came here to study your cousin and your uncle's household, and whether I could bear to marry into a family that valued alliance above every honest feeling, and within 3 days of my arrival, I had stopped thinking of the survey entirely, because I could not stop thinking of you. I did not stay silent in that library because I doubted your worth, Eleanor. I stayed silent because for the first time in my life, someone had spoken to me as though I were simply a man, and I was too great a coward to risk losing that by telling you I was something else entirely." "That is not an apology," she said, though her voice had lost some of its fury. "No," he agreed, "it is not. I have no apology equal to what I owe you. I can only tell you that everything I said to you in this garden, in the orangery, on every walk we have taken together, every word of it was true, spoken by the same man, whatever name he gave you. I did not perform kindness to win your trust for some later use. I do not know how to prove that to you now except to say it, plainly, and to ask you to judge me by what I do next, rather than what I failed to say soon enough." She was silent a long moment, the wind moving the bare branches above them, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone very quiet. "I cannot afford to hope, Your Grace. I have learned, at great cost, what it does to a person to hope for things that are never truly meant for them." "Then do not hope," Julian said. "Only wait. Give me the chance to prove it, not in words, but in what I am willing to do to protect you. And if I fail you, you will have lost nothing you did not already expect to lose." She did not answer him. But she did not walk away either, and in the particular grammar of a woman who had spent her whole life guarding herself against disappointment, Julian understood that this, her simple failure to refuse him outright, was itself a kind of answer, fragile and unspoken, but real. He acted within the week. He went first to Lord Pembroke, not as a suitor negotiating terms, but as a duke exercising the plain weight of his rank, and informed him with a coldness that left no room for argument that he would not be proceeding with any arrangement regarding Miss Camilla Pembroke, that he had, upon reflection, found the household's conduct toward Miss Eleanor Winslow beneath the standard he required of any family he might ally himself with, and that he intended, further, to settle Lord Pembroke's outstanding debt to Mr. Silas Crane in full himself, on the sole condition that Crane's claim upon Miss Winslow's hand be withdrawn entirely and permanently, in writing, witnessed by his own solicitor. Lord Pembroke's protests died quickly under the plain arithmetic of the offer. A debt cleared entirely was worth more to a desperate man than a match, however grand, that might yet fall through, and within 2 days, Crane, presented with a settlement considerably more generous than the partial forgiveness he had originally angled for, signed the release without more than a flicker of regret, having never, in truth, cared for Eleanor herself so much as for the convenience of the arrangement. Camilla's fury, when she understood what had happened, was not directed at Julian, but, with the particular cruelty of a woman who had never learned to examine her own conduct, at Eleanor, a bitter, public accusation delivered in the drawing-room before the assembled family that her cousin had schemed, connived, and stolen a match that ought rightfully to have been hers. It was Julian who answered her, quietly, but with a authority that silenced the room entirely. "Miss Winslow schemed for nothing," he said. "She did not know my rank until the whole household learned it together. What she offered me, before I had any title to recommend myself with, was honesty. which is a good deal more than I have received from anyone else in this house since my arrival, yourself included." He turned to Lord Pembroke, whose face had gone the colour of old parchment. "I would ask that Miss Winslow's position in this household be reconsidered, not as an unpaid dependent, but as a woman deserving of the same respect and provision you have always extended to your own daughters. I make this request as a matter of decency. I will not make it twice." It was not in the end a demand he needed to repeat, for Lord Pembroke, recalculating once more the value of remaining in a duke's good favour, found himself suddenly and enthusiastically persuaded of his niece's many overlooked virtues. Eleanor learned of all of it second-hand, in fragments, from a household abuzz with the scandal and reversal of it, and it was 2 days before she found Julian alone again in the library where it had all begun, standing this time in plain daylight, with no candle and no shelf to hide behind. "You settled Crane's claim," she said, without preamble, standing in the doorway, as though unwilling yet to fully enter the room that held so much of what had broken, and perhaps so much of what might yet be mended. "I did. You did not have to. I did," he said again, more gently. "Not because I believed it would win your forgiveness, Eleanor. I do not believe forgiveness can be purchased, and I would not insult you by attempting it. I did it because no woman who spoke to me the way you did in this room should ever again be treated as a line in someone else's ledger. That much, at least, was owed to you, regardless of what you decide to feel for me." She crossed the room slowly, until she stood near enough that he could see the tears standing unshed in her eyes, not the hidden, rationed tears of the woman who had once wept alone in a window seat, believing no one would ever hear her, but tears offered now in plain sight, to him, deliberately. "I told you once," she said, "that I would rather be alone forever than be loved the way Camilla wished to be loved, as a use, a convenience, a debt discharged." Her voice trembled, but she did not look away from him. "I do not think you have loved me that way, Your Grace. I have turned it over every night since Crane's letter arrived, and I cannot make myself believe that a man seeking only convenience would have humbled himself before my uncle, or paid a debt he owed nothing toward, or stood in a drawing-room and told my cousin, to her face, that I was worth more than she had ever allowed herself to see." "I love you," Julian said, simply, because there was no longer any disguise left to hide behind, no title or false name standing between them, only the plain truth he had carried since the moment he first heard her weeping in the dark and could not make himself walk away. "Not for your patience or your usefulness or anything this house has ever valued in you. I love you for exactly what you told this room, believing no one listened. Your honesty, your dignity, the way you have survived 7 years of being treated as though you mattered least, and have come out of it kinder than anyone who wronged you. I do not ask you to forget that I failed you once. I ask only that you let me spend whatever years you will allow me, proving that I will not fail you again." Eleanor closed the last small distance between them, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been in the whole of that long and painful fortnight. "I hid in this library once," she said, "certain that no one in the world cared enough to hear me. I think I have spent my whole life believing that was simply the truth of things, that I would always weep in rooms no one entered, and be loved by no one, and matter to no one beyond what I could do for them." A tremulous, disbelieving smile broke through. "You have made a liar of me, Your Grace. I find I do not mind it half so much as I expected to." "Julian," he said, "if you will have me, not the Duke, not the title, but the man who could not stop listening, that first night, because he had never before heard anyone tell the truth so completely." "Julian," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and found that it fit as easily as though she had been saying it all along. Their wedding, when it came the following spring, was neither grand nor rushed, but exactly the size and shape Eleanor herself had chosen. A small chapel near Rothmere's principal estate, filled with the people who had actually shown her kindness across the whole of her life, rather than the crowds who now, having learned of her elevation, competed loudly for the privilege of claiming her friendship. Lord and Lady Pembroke attended, subdued and careful, having learned at last a measure of humility they had never once thought to practice, while she was merely their poor niece. Camilla did not come, having removed herself in high dudgeon to a distant aunt's household, from which, it was later reported, she made an entirely satisfactory match with a baronet of modest fortune and considerably lower expectations, a resolution that struck no one at Rothmere as anything other than fitting. Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of pale grey silk, her own choice, a quiet, deliberate echo of the plain dress she had worn the night Julian first heard her weeping, worn now, not in grief, but in triumphant memory of everything that dress had witnessed, and everything it had, against every reasonable expectation, led to. "You are certain," Julian murmured to her, as the small gathered company waited, "that grey suits a duchess?" "I am certain," Eleanor said, "that it suited the woman you fell in love with, long before you knew what to call her, and I find I have no wish to be any other woman than the one you first heard, telling the truth in the dark." He took her hand then, before the whole of the small and honest company that had gathered to witness it, and if there were those among the aristocracy who murmured for a season or two about the plain niece who had somehow, against every rule of that careful world, become a duchess, the murmuring did nothing at all to touch the quiet certainty that had settled, at last, into the centre of Eleanor's chest, the certainty, hard won, and finally fully believed, that she was loved, not for her usefulness, not for any debt she offset, or any convenience she offered, but simply, entirely, for herself, exactly as she was, in every room she ever again had cause to enter, lit or unlit, witnessed or alone. And in the years that followed, whenever Julian told the story of how he had won his wife, to their children, eventually, gathered by the fire at Rothmere on winter evenings, he never once began it with the ballroom, or the title, or the letter that had unmasked him before he was ready. He began it, always, in the dark of a country library, with a girl who believed herself entirely alone, and a man who had been too moved by her honesty to announce himself in time, and who had spent every year since trying, and by every account succeeding, to make certain she never again believed, for even a single moment, that her tears fell where no one cared enough to hear them.